In Chapter 13, Section 2 is about inflation. So this is our second economic challenge that we'll be looking at in this chapter. So what are the causes and effects of inflation? Well, what is inflation to start with? It is a general increase in prices across the economy. Now, if we look at this picture here of this house, and if we would have purchased this house back in 1960, we could have paid $12,000 for it. But if we wanted to sell that house today, the current price would probably go somewhere around $120,000. How is that possible that a house can increase by that percentage over, 1960 to 2010 over a 50-year period? Well, the answer would be inflation. And inflation affects all the prices, all the items that we purchase. It affects our purchasing power, the ability to purchase goods and services. Now, the owners of this house, if they're the original owner from 1960, they'd be pretty excited about the value of the home. But if they would not be able to take this money and get that same amount of house somewhere else. So inflation does affect our purchasing power. Now, how do they come up with this inflation rate? Well, we use something called the price index. And this shows the average price of a standard group of goods that change over time. We use one of the most common price indexes that are used out there is called CPI. And what it does, it goes around and finds out what are typical items that an urban consumer would purchase. And they come up with 8 different categories. And they put in everything into this market basket. So the 8 things that we would find in there would be anything from food and drink to housing, apparel, transportation, medical care, entertainment, education, any other goods and services they might purchase. So they do this over a period of time, and every 8 years it's updated so that the items that people are purchasing, we know that it's actually current, and it's a good tool to use. So in the CPI, they come up with these 8 categories. Usually they'll survey like 10,000 families and thousands of them will keep journals for a 2-week period to just record everything that was purchased. And then what they do with this information is they throw it into a spreadsheet and they calculate it to find out what are the most common themes, things that are purchased. And then from there, they'll go and research prices when it comes to this to find out what urban consumers are typically buying throughout a month or throughout a year. Once they calculate that number, now that creates a base year that they will follow over the next 8 years. So if it's 2010 when they calculated this, they will use this all the way through 2008 and always refer to it back as the base year. It's kind of the same concept of real GDP and nominal GDP, where you use a base year to find out how much inflation is actually a part of the GDP that's being grown. So in CPI, they have something called a market basket. And again, that's that 8 different categories that they use to calculate a CPI number. So whatever they get that number, that becomes the base year. Now, for the CPI, they are looking to calculate the inflation rate. How much is inflation growing from year to year, month to month? And by having that base year, they can determine that. So you really only need 2 things to determine CPI, the current year cost and a base period cost. In your homework assignment that deals with inflation, you will be taking certain items and calculating how much inflation has grown in those particular items that are out there. So the number they're getting from CPI, they're using that as a base year, and the result from this, from calculating CPI, they can find out how much inflation is growing from year to year. Now, typical inflation is anywhere from 1 to 3%. Anything above that, people begin to get worried. If it goes above 5%, then there's something to worry about. And if it increases even more than that, known as hyperinflation, this means prices are completely out of control. I don't know if you can figure out what countries they were during after World War I, but this nation had extreme hyperinflation. It was so bad that you would have to get paid twice a day from your work, because by the time the end of the day be done, the rate that you were been paid has already been significantly affected by the inflation rate. When you would go in to eat dinner somewhere, you would have to calculate, or you'd have to negotiate price before you made the purchase, because by the time you're done eating your meal, inflation has already gone up. Inflation was so bad that kids were playing with money than actually going out and buying toys because it was cheaper. So there's a video that I have attached to Classroom. I want you to watch that hyperinflation that took place in this country during this time. And it just gives more facts and interesting history of what took place during this time and how the rise of an evil empire came out of this. So that'll probably give it away right there. But go ahead and watch that video. All right, so you just got finished watching the video, and if you watched it, you find out, yes, it was Germany right after World War I, and as a result of this hyperinflation and the economy being in uproar and being a mess, they had the rise of Adolf Hitler. And a lot can be said after a war on what takes place. Do you leave the enemy decimated, or do you try to rebuild them? And ever since World War I, that has always been the goal, that we will go in, and if the United States destroys a nation, we would go in and rebuild it to avoid another Hitler in this time. So that's why what we've done in the Middle East, we're there trying to rebuild. After we destroyed Japan during World War II, we went in and rebuilt that as well. We didn't want history to repeat itself. All right, so what are some causes of inflation? Well, one can be the growth of the money supply. And the money supply is the amount of money that they print. Now, if we go to our laws of demand and also supply, we know about a shortage and a surplus and how they work around equilibrium. Same thing is referred to with the money supply. If you print too much, we have a surplus of it, meaning the value is going to drop. It's going to have to drop to return to equilibrium, but prices increase. So there was a school in Chicago came up with this economic theory known as the quantity theory that actually put this to test. And they said that the amount of money that we print should be tied to the economy as inflation rate. So as inflation would rise, we would increase the amount of money. If it would decrease, same way it goes there. So it's tied to it. Wherever direction it goes, the printing would continue that way as well. Another cause would be change in aggregate demand. And we looked at this in the last chapter. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and how they work, and how they tie into all this. So aggregate demand. If we have, all of a sudden, if we go to war, we now have an increase in aggregate demand. It would move to the right on the graph. As a result, that means now we are going to have a shortage of certain products. And once we hit the shortage, we go into disequilibrium. And then as a result, how do we return to equilibrium? We have to raise the price. When the price raises, that means inflation will rise as well. And your item that you purchased for, let's say, $100 this year, and if inflation rises by 10%, then for the following year, you're buying the same item for 110%. That is inflation. The product has not increased. It has not gotten better, but the price has increased due to inflation. Now, change in aggregate supply, this is kind of the same idea. So if raw materials increase for a corporation or manufacturer, that means they have to raise the price on their products. And as a result, things would be higher. So even though the raw material is the same raw material, it is going up. For some reason, there's a factor that affected it. Now, we have something called an aggregate supply, the wage price spiral. Now, this often takes place in many businesses. So, as we know, the purpose of a firm, a business, is to make profit. That's why they're there. But let's say we have an increase in rising raw materials, then they have to increase the price. Well, if they have to increase the price, then that makes items more expensive for people to purchase. Well, then let's just kind of say that, let's just go with bread, for example. And we have this bread company. And the price of wheat has gone up, so we got to increase our loaf of bread. Well, then let's say our workers buy bread from our stores to survive, to eat. Well, then what they're going to do is they'll come to the boss, the manager, and be like, hey, inflation has gone up, bread is more expensive, we want to have higher wages. And this is where unions come into play and there's negotiation. And let's say at the end of the day, the boss says, okay, yes, we will increase your price or what we're paying you by 10%. Well, if the raw materials goes up and now we're paying our employees more, what is the business going to do? They're going to increase the price as well. And so then the workers are happy because they got a raise, but when they go to the store the next day, they'd be like, hey, the price of bread has gone up again. So they're going to go back to the boss and then will negotiate. If they increase the price, they will increase their wages they're paid, but then the next day the price is going to go up again. So you have this wage price spiral that is going back and forth when it comes to this. And this could be an aggregate, a hard place to be in for a business, especially if wages just continue to increase. Because if they're not making their profit, well, they're not going to be in business. So when you increase the price of wages, then higher prices, then higher prices, then wages, just goes back and forth when it comes to this. What are some other effects of inflation? Purchasing power. As we already looked at previously in the notes, purchasing power. This is the ability to buy goods and services. When inflation increases, this means purchasing power goes down. We don't have as much power as we used to. How does this affect income when it comes to this inflation? Well, for someone that has a business or is working, let's say a doctor, lawyer, businessman, businesswoman, what they can simply do, as we just saw in the wage price spiral, is they can increase the price. So it really doesn't affect the inflation rate too much when it comes to these individuals. Who it affects the most is people on fixed incomes. Now, sometimes if you're in a salary position and that you're making that per year, if inflation increases by 10%, now it's going to mean that you are making less money than you were from the year before because of inflation. So for every dollar that you are making, and if inflation increases by 10%, you are now only making 90 cents on the dollar. So fixed income. Also people who are retired, they're no longer working or unable to work. Their fixed income is being hammered with this as well because they have no way to supplement this shortage of 10 cents for every dollar that they have. So fixed income. When thinking about retirement, inflation is something that has to come into play as well. Because before you know it, if you get to retirement, you may have your money may be worth less than it was before because of inflation. And then this also affects the interest rates. If inflation goes up, that means interest rates will go up. That means we have more money supply that is being printed. And as a result, interest rates will increase. So that is the other part. Also with the interest rates, if it also affects investments. So let's say that you have a 7% interest rate return on a bond and you're tied in for 10 years and interest rate increases to 5%. Now that means you're only making a 2% return. So inflation can also affect interest rates. Last slide. Recent trends in inflation. Now, when we think of inflation going up, that's always a bad thing in our mind, but that's not necessarily true. We have something called deflation, and this is where all price level again is what we find in macroeconomics. That means all prices are dropping. Now, this can be a result of a couple things. One, it can mean that the unemployment rate is so high that no one is able to buy items. And then we find ourselves that we're at disequilibrium. And how do we get, if we have a surplus of items, how do we get back to equilibrium? We have to drop the price. So if employment is high, people are limited on what they can purchase. As a result of this, they now have to drop their price when it comes to this number. So, drop in prices. 2007, 2008, we had a crisis. We had an energy crisis where it made things very expensive when it came to this. As a result, from 2007, 2008, the price of food and gasoline skyrocketed. And this is where we talked about $4 a gallon gas, the price of bread, milk, everything was increasing dramatically. Now, there's a theory out there. Part of the reason why we had this crisis was the increase to search for an alternative fuel source rather than gasoline. And a lot of people, a lot of speculation is saying that it's the E85 ethanol that really affected the prices of food and gasoline. And here's why. With this, we find that, let's say we're at equilibrium right now. We have the perfect amount of corn feeding the livestock, and everything is equilibrium. Now, all of a sudden, since there's mandates and now there is subsidies, money given to farmers that will decide to grow these types of crops, so corn, so they can turn to ethanol. Now we have a shortage. The amount where we had equilibrium, perfect amount of corn being fed to livestock, now there's less corn available. As a result, disequilibrium. As a result, prices have to increase on food. Well, if the price on food increases, you got it. It has to increase for the farmers to buy the price for corn, and then the farmer that has the livestock is now going to increase the price for its meat. And then the stores that buy the meat wholesale will now have to increase their price in the stores, which then affects the consumer, which would be us. So as a result of this crisis, some people say it's the E85 ethanol that is taking corn that should be specifically used only for livestock, and as a result, the prices increase dramatically with food and gasoline. So those are inflation rates that we got to cover so far today when it comes to this, and hopefully you've got a good idea now on how inflation works. If there's any questions, please let me know. The homework assignment you have will demonstrate how to calculate inflation.